a peaceful place in the sky.
I would like to share with you one of the main reasons why I started Even at the Doors, and it may shock you. It was as a result of an individual who has agitated me throughout the majority of my life, though I've never had the opportunity of meeting him. His name is Christopher Columbus. And as you go through this study, especially the last 15 minutes, you're going to see the effect this individual has had on my life. There are three main things that have shaped and molded my character. And as I go through this study, I'll go through each of them. Number one, being born in the United Kingdom. Number two, my Caribbean heritage. And number three, the Word of God. And as I encourage you at all times, though this is my personal testimony, please research everything you see in this study.
After the Second World War, the country known as Great Britain was trying to rebuild itself. Many found solace in sport, especially football, as a kind of escapism. It also saw a huge flood of immigrants entering its shores, some by plane, others by boat. They were from the former colonies, and they came for economic reasons, to better themselves and to start new families. Some were welcomed with open arms, others received hostility, and the more that came, the greater the tensions. The United States of America was beginning to have an influence on the British youth culture, and as many young people were trying to find themselves and looking for an identity, they embraced their fashion and their political causes. But not everybody wanted to be hippies and high on marijuana. Vietnam was not their war, and many could not relate to a very distant middle-class culture, and a new trend was to emerge of men and women who wore tight denim jeans, Dr. Martens shoes, braces, shaved their heads, and they would listen to and dance to Jamaican ska and reggae music. They called themselves skinheads, and they consisted of both black and white youth in Britain. But its objective from very early was tarnished when far-right groups embraced the culture, and skinheads today are sadly associated with racist groups. Influential political figures were provoking the spread of multicultural communities, and in 1 year it was about to explode. In 1981, the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the first female who took that office, was in power. In that same year, the whole world would be glued to their TV sets in what was probably the most televised and watched wedding in modern history between the current British King Charles III and the late Princess Diana. But underneath the glitz, glamour and patronage of that aristocratic spectacle, trouble was brewing, and a political volcano was about to erupt, and the lava and ashes of years of discontent were about to spew out. But there are some who romanticize and downplay the past by ignoring unresolved, deep-rooted historical schisms.
It's hard to believe now, but Britain wasn't always a regional banking center / refugee camp. It was a real place with a history and a language and a culture and a genuinely remarkable people. A country in the North Atlantic the size of Alabama that somehow took over the world and ruled it with decency unmatched by any empire in human history. The very least you can say about the English is that they took their colonial responsibilities seriously. They didn't just take things, they added. The British did give the world the Magna Carta and habeas corpus and free speech. The British Empire spread Protestant Christianity to the entire world.
If you ever have the opportunity to visit the British Isles, you'll see carved into stone a number of memorials of what many who are familiar with British history are proud of. It is called the Magna Carta, a decree or law that was sealed in around 1215 AD. that introduced trial by jury and allows a fair trial for civilians to be treated by their peers. Two writers who knew of its important value to protect us from government tyranny wrote of its timeless benefits. And the first writer and historian said, quote, "The great principle conceded so early as the days of King John in Magna Charta," says Dr. James Aitken Wiley, afterwards confirmed in the reign of Charles II in the famous act of habeas corpus, and held by statesmen who have flourished since to be one of the foundations of British liberty, namely the inviolability of the subject save by the authority of law. First witness. The most venerable original source of modern democracy in the West was the Magna Carta, says the late Avro Manhattan. With that document, and for the first time, certain basic principles of individual freedom were set forth. These, although very inadequate to our own eyes, were later to become the stem from which almost all democratic principles accepted by the West were eventually to blossom. Second witness. It is a very beautiful document and will always benefit you if you happen to live within the British Isles. But those the British invaded and colonized were sadly not to reap its benefits. Geographically located in the North Atlantic Ocean and situated within the gates of the Protestant Anglo-Saxon world, the Emerald Isle, better known as Ireland, has been held hostage for almost a millennia by two imperialisms. In the 12th century, under Nicholas Breakspear, known as Adrian A, the one and only English Pope, he encouraged King Henry II of England to invade Ireland, granting the king hereditary lordship of Ireland on behalf of the papacy, making it a territory in bondage to both the English, one imperialism, and Catholicism, another imperialism. During the Troubles in Ireland, trial by jury, that is habeas corpus, was denied to the Irish, who called themselves freedom fighters, but the British government called them terrorists. But what has been the effects of this very sad and destructive ideological, religious, political, and ethnic conflict? The trauma still affects both children and adults, where in December 2019, the New York Times documented that Ireland had one of the highest suicide rates on the entire earth. The effects of the conflict has resulted in hundreds and thousands seeing no hope in the future and just ending their lives. Sad. And the year 1981 was one of the deciding factors that has contributed to this nihilistic worldview, especially the hunger strikes in the famous Maze prison that led to the deaths of men like Bobby Sands. But it wasn't just the Irish who were feeling the effects of British colonialism. Other grievances were being felt on the mainland. The New York Times in 1981 documented that riots were also sweeping England's cities and anarchy was feared. The descendants of West Indians and Indians in Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Brixton and Southall, and maybe a few other places, were rioting from April to July 1981 that caused damage to properties worth £45 million. While many think that the riots were solely over race, the indigenous English were also rioting because the issues were over a combination of factors that included race, unemployment, hooliganism, alienation of youth, unsatisfactory housing conditions, and suspicion over the impartiality of the police, who for the first time in British history used CS gas on the mainland. A song was written in response to the conflict called Ghost Town by The Specials that vented out society's grievances. And I remember dancing to that song at church as a 5-year-old child, with the older guys, they're being caught and verbally scolded by my parents for not only listening to secular music, but winding up my waist to that song. I got roasted. But the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, hated one of the most watched videos during the beginning of the March 2020 global lockdown, because it was hitting at the root of Thatcher's privatisation of British companies and eventually her clamping down on miners and trade unions. So in response to the riots, the British government was to introduce a new law that, if my parents didn't act swiftly, would have made me stateless with no official identity. It was to replace jus soli, that is birthright citizenship, that existed for 7 centuries, where anyone born on the British mainland was automatically a citizen. And the late Right Honourable Viscount William Stephen Ian Whitelaw, the Home Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was the mastermind behind the British Nationality Act 1981 that was to determine my destiny. But what exactly did it consist of?
6 years ago now, Shamima Begum left her home in East London for a new life in war-torn Syria. She would become infamous worldwide as an ISIS bride.
She is now desperate to come home from the Syrian detention camp where she's being held. But the Home Office has revoked her British citizenship, and the courts have refused her appeals to come back.
Please find enclosed papers that relate to a decision taken by the Home Secretary to deprive your daughter Shamima Begum of her British citizenship. In light of the circumstances of your daughter, the notice of the Home Secretary's decision has been served on file today, 19th February, and the order removing her citizenship has subsequently been made.
You know, she's stuck now in some sort of limbo without any prospect of returning to her family, nor really of being a free woman. She's only 23, she's got a lot of her life left, and she's stuck in a camp in northeast Syria, which is not particularly safe place to be for anybody, let alone a woman of that age. And where does she go? What happens to her?
Margaret Thatcher, nicknamed the Milk Snatcher, won a landslide re-election victory in 1983, not only for winning the Falklands War the previous year in 1982 that boosted her very low ratings at the time, but also for officially passing the British Nationality Act that redefined citizenship and was designed to discourage and hinder more immigrants from flooding into the country. According to the New York Times article titled "Disputed Citizenship Law in Effect in Britain," it said that in 1983, Britain's Nationality Act, a principal feature of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's election platform, have been criticised by many as a racist attempt to clean up the non-white debris of empire. It also ends the 7th century-old legal tradition of jus soli, or right of the soil, by which any child born in Britain was automatically eligible for citizenship. It greatly increases the number of stateless men, women, and children. This is an ongoing struggle for people either trying to enter into Britain or are already living in the country as a British citizen, where they have been able to skillfully get descendants of immigrants to pass these laws that their very own parents had to contend and wrestle with. That's strange. For a new bill in 2021 quietly gives powers to remove British citizenship without you even being given forewarning or notice. And many who have been here since the first set of bills were introduced are now still very worried if they officially pass the Nationality and Borders Bill. This started with the Aliens Act of 1905 that was primarily designed, as it says, to prevent the landing of undesirable immigrants. It later became the British Nationality Act of 1948, then the Commonwealth Immigrations Act of 1962, then the Commonwealth Immigrations Act of 1968, then the Immigration Act of 1971 that continued with the British Nationality Act of 1981, which was a response to the riots. As a child, I was totally oblivious and ignorant to what was going on concerning my well-being and my citizenship. I was just enjoying myself and living a carefree life. But let me begin my journey on why I started even at the doors, and I shall take you into the opening chapter of my life. And interestingly enough, it started in 1983, where my deep curiosity as a child began. I was educated in a predominantly white school in northwest London, and I had absolutely brilliant teachers and lovely classmates. It was kind of like a close-knit family. But there was something that really bugged me. It was how we are socially trained to look at history through one narrow lens. And there was this one historical figure that I had a big problem with, and I had little idea how much he personally affected my life. In the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. in the United States of America, there is a painting of the Western world's iconic hero landing in the West Indies in the Caribbean. He was an Italian explorer and navigator who went by the name of Cristoforo Colombo, better known today as Christopher Columbus. And as a child, I would ask myself these questions. How could someone discover America who didn't even land in America? And if the Amerindian Taino people were living there already, then how could he discover it if it was already inhabited by different tribes of people? This was the start of this maze on my very lonely journey of investigation and research. For you're constantly seeking for clues, getting answers, and then it opens the doors to more and more credible historical data. And you realize that the westernized system that you are educated in would prefer to erase your memories from a pre-Columbian history so that everyone stays in line and asks no questions. So one of my dreams in life was answering my own questions with a camera, and I always dreamed as a child to make documentaries. But I knew that I had to learn and master some ancient disciplines so that my arguments are very airtight. So my style and method of research is titled autodidactic. That means that I am self-taught. As you learn as you go along, no one is really going to help you. So you have to teach yourself everything from how to study history and even how to use a DSLR camera. I would spend hours in London's National Archives so I could get access to official authentic state records. And this was as a result of a book I purchased titled Jesuit Plots by the late British historicist Protestant writer Albert Close. He wrote it in response to two Roman Catholic historians who were fabricating history. One was Evelyn Waugh, the English writer, and Hilaire Belloc, the Franco-English writer and historian. And Albert Close said that after years of research in the Public Record Office, now called the National Archives, amongst the old state papers of the Reformation period, I have come to the conclusion that no historian should be trusted who systematically avoids giving his references. I came across a West Indian called Frantz Fanon in my family library with a book he wrote titled Black Skin, White Masks. And this late psychologist said that to understand something new requires that we make ourselves ready for it, that we prepare ourselves for it. It entails the shaping of a new form. In another book titled Reflections on Violence, another man from the French-speaking world also taught the most effective nonconformist way to approach history. Love of truth, says George S. Sorel, has become a rare enough quality. So true. It is not the business of the historian to award prizes for virtue, to propose the erection of statues, or to establish any catechism whatever. His business is to understand what is least individual in the course of events. The question which interests the chroniclers and excite novelists are those he most willingly leaves on one side. Another writer of French descent also shares the importance of studying history, and I shall repeat what he said from a previous study. Jean Henry Mel said that to understand the present, guess what? We must know the past. But what is the most effective method of studying the past? He continues. One of the first essentials for the proper understanding of history is to do what? Transport ourselves into the times we are describing. But there are very, very few individuals who possess the intellectual strength required for such a task, and hence arise so many prejudices. So your mind has to be thoroughly trained to go back in time and don't measure the past standards with present methods. So you study the Greek historian Herodotus on the left and Thucydides on the right if you want to thoroughly know about ancient Greece in the 5th century BC and surrounding nations. You study Julius Caesar's own words in his time period if you want to understand the ancient Roman world in that time period. If you want to study about the Nestorian Christian church in Asia, the largest church in history, then you read their own works from their own time period instead of secondary sources. And if you read O Lauda Equiano, the Igbo of Nigeria, you'll get to see what Africa was actually like in the 18th century. And he makes no mention of them selling their own people to European slave traders as he was stolen. That took place much later. So this is how I study history. I go to the original, authentic sources to strengthen my case. When I was very young, I would spend hours and hours watching television. I was absolutely fascinated with the media and was mesmerized with how a camera and an editing studio could manipulate sounds, shapes and colors. And I would get into trouble a lot with my parents because they thought I should be more focused on doing my homework, studying and reading plenty of books. Watching the TV was preparing me for the future. For if I did not spend time in front of the TV, I wouldn't be able to critically assess what I'd watch when I was growing up. Neither would I be able to learn the different methods of editing to prepare regular studies. And England was or is the best place to learn my craft, and I will explain. In the summer of the year 2022, I was in Greenwich in southeast London, and I would regularly walk past this building called the Old Naval College. But curiosity drove me to enter into its vicinity. But there was something that caught my attention that I did not quite understand at the time, until this woman explained it to me. I saw loads of people filming like they were shooting a documentary or a film. And then on further research, I now understand why. It is a magnet of a location for the filming industry. And according to the Empire magazine, it is the most popular filming location in the world. This is in the grounds of the Naval College, and it was used for a scene in a film called Thor: The Dark World. Yes, the Naval College is located right next to the River Thames in Greenwich, and this was one of the main locations where Thor was shot and filmed at London's Old Naval College in Greenwich in southeast London. But it wasn't the only one. There are many others. Here's a scene of two buildings on either side, also overlooking the River Thames. And using either blue or green screen, the film The Golden Compass was shot. And if you carefully look at all of these film trailers, it looks like it is one of the number one location in the world where Hollywood chooses to prepare people to be entertained, whether it be action, violence or witchcraft, with the Golden Compass. But I wanted to do something a little different. All film production is for the glory and praise of men. I wanted to create Even at the Doors solely for the glory of God, and use the camera lens to magnify the one who sits on a throne in heaven. And from when I started my first school until I finished university, I would have regular debates with the Gentiles over creation versus evolution. And I remember working for a company, and in a debate, I asked them a very simple question. Can you take me to London's Natural History Museum and please show me in the fossil record how one species evolved into another? They were speechless, and I still wait my invite. So I go through museums in the UK and carefully look at artifacts of animals, and I discovered that man, from the earliest of time, not only represented animals in his earliest artwork, but was artistically gifted and talented from antiquity. This is a very detailed carving from ivory from early France in Europe. It is of an animal called a deer, and the detail is to artistic precision. This is a carving in stone of a vulture from the Sudan in Northeast Africa. And if you look at it very carefully, it also accurately resembles the scavenger bird who hovers over dead carcasses, the vulture. Now, these images of lions from ancient Assyria in northern Iraq in Western Asia also shows how very skilled and detailed those Near Eastern artists were when they carved it so precision-like into stone that also resembles that mammal, the lion. So man has always been artistically creative. I would also use my camera in different fields, in parks, in my own garden, on the streets and in zoos to capture the beauty of wildlife or nature. And as my parents gave me a great appreciation for nature from very young when they would take me out to the parks, it is beautiful to capture the diversity in the animal kingdom that God created. But we are living in a time where men are rewriting the true story of natural history, removing God out of the affairs of human and natural history, and presenting a deliberate, distorted view of Earth's past.
Creation is an act of sheer will. Life will find a way.
What is that?
Biggest carnivore the world has ever seen.
Run!
With its intense music, fast edit cuts within a heart-pumping trailer, Hollywood can stimulate your mind and draw you into its intellectual pantheism of primeval times. If you carefully listen to the trailer of Jurassic World Dominion, it said that creation is an act of sheer will. Life will find a way. So God is not the creator, and animals will function in a world through natural selection, the survival of the fittest. And the reptiles called dinosaurs are presented to the public as carnivores, that is, meat-eating animals. But what saith the evidence? According to the most reliable record of the true origin of species, it is in the first book of the Holy Scriptures, originally called Bereshith, but today we call it in the English tongue Genesis. And in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 30, it recorded that every single creature that God put on this earth were originally herbivores, where every green herb was its meat. In other words, all species originally had a plant-based diet, and the evidence supports the authority of the Word of God. This is the remains of an extinct reptile that was discovered in Alberta, Canada. And on close examination of this species, its stomach content confirms the book of Genesis. The London Guardian documents that it is the world's best preserved armored dinosaur. And Vice News said that the most impressive dinosaur fossil just got 3D scanned. When men have gone into the lab to study its diet, you get a complete different view to modern Western secular science. These are the microscopic particles they found within the gut of this extinct species. And they found that, contrary to the Jurassic series, dinosaurs were originally herbivores that lived by a strict divine ordained diet that God ordained for the animal kingdom from the beginning of time. And London's Royal Society of Science published a paper and confirmed that the paleoecology of this early Cretaceous armored dinosaur was based on a floral, that is the Latin root for the English flower, analysis of its stomach contents. When we flick through our TV channels, many of us are hooked by the different nature or wildlife documentaries, but they are not actually introducing to us something new. When they are sharing with us about how the eagle becomes airborne by studying the volume of the air currents and how its eyes has a superior magnification than any other creature in the animal kingdom, they are a bit late and only sharing with us what the Bible has already said. In a huge volume set titled The Encyclopedia of Biblical, Theological and Ecclesiastical Literature, published in the 19th century, American Bible student John McClintock on the left and James Strong, author of the Strong's Concordance, on the right, compiled a thorough study of the eagle in the Bible and of ancient Greek authorities. It read that the word eagle occurs in scripture as the translation of the Hebrew nasher, so called from tearing its prey with its beak. So how it cuts its prey with its beak is why it was called nasher in Hebrew. The characteristic of the eagle referred to in the Holy Scriptures are its swiftness in flight in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 49, in 2 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 23, and in Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 13. Its mounting high into the air in Job chapter 39 and verse 27, and in Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 5, Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 19, and Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 31, as well as Jeremiah chapter 49 and verse 16. The Holy Scriptures describe its effortless, graceless beauty in flight. That is amazing. Its strength and vigor in Psalm 103 and verse 5. Its predaceous habits in Job chapter 9 and verse 26. Its setting its nest in high places, again in Jeremiah chapter 49 and verse 16. And the care in training its young to fly in Exodus chapter 19 and verse 4, and in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 11. So God gives a very detailed description of this flying wonder that He created. But guess what? There's more. Its power of vision in Job chapter 39 verses 27 to 29. Now her vision and her distinct eyefield makes her see things 4 to 8 times further than the average human. It is known to have the sharpest eye in the animal kingdom, and it's molting in Psalms 103 and verse 5. As king of birds, the eagle naturally became an emblem of powerful empires in Ezekiel chapter 17 verses 3 and 7, especially in the symbolic figures of Babylon in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 4. So the eagle is not only used in symbolic prophetic language to describe a world empire, but its unique attributes in the animal kingdom has singled it out as probably the most recorded animal in the Holy Scriptures. But not everybody wants to give the Most High God His due.
What's heaven?
It's a peaceful place in the sky.
Are you going to heaven?
No.
Why not?
You gotta be a good person to go to heaven.
We're the same. We can't go to heaven because you're not good. And I'm not a person.
Mr. Darwin, your theory is hugely powerful.
Suppose everyone stopped believing that God had any sort of plan for us.
Clearly the Almighty can no longer claim to have authored every species in under a week. You've killed God, sir.
Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. We can often recognize the best and worst of ourselves in them.
I'm dealing with the future of the planet. I'm the necessary shock to the system. I am human evolutionary change. Bulletproof. Superhuman.
And if history has proven anything, it is that evolution always wins.
The birth of our time. 13 billion years ago, the Big Bang. It took many billions of years for Earth to flicker into life. The clouds and oceans formed. Life was made possible. It took billions of years for life to become human, for humans to stand up, and now we write the next chapter in a story of life, of creativity that started 13 billion years ago, but has no end.
You who were formed by the heat of the galaxy. What a thing to be, both unique and familiar.
I'm from outer space, I got Milky Way for blood, evolution in my veins.
There are a number of plaques, monuments and names engraved into stone in London, England, of men in the 19th century born in the British Isles whose unscientific, secular heathen ideas have impacted to this very day the entire world. And those previous clips from people in both the music and film industry were inspired by the thoughts of these men. They are still questioning the ideas and theories of these men because they are realizing that it does not align with the evidence that is now available to us. And these men who inspired and influenced modern science are Herbert Spencer in the background, famous for coining the phrase the survival of the fittest, Thomas Huxley on the right, Sir Francis Galton on the left, the father of eugenics that today is renamed genetics, and his cousin in the bottom center, who he shared a grandfather with, Charles Darwin, who popularized the views of their grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. But Charles Darwin actually became famous for it. But these men have never really fazed me, because as a child, I knew their ideas would eventually be disproven, even if the masses naively believed in it. I knew that once the prophetic clock started to wind down, more and more truths would slowly and gradually come to light, and sincere men and women would share with the public revelations of things that would shock them. I knew that classified documents will become declassified so that people can sift through the fake traditional narratives of a historical event. I always knew that top secret documents will also reveal what men in line with the invisible government were really doing to their civilian populations. And I knew as a child, Earth is going to give up their secrets, and all the different fields of science will reveal to a new generation precious, lost historical truths. And as I grew older, one person confirmed my queries. Jesus said in Luke chapter 12 and verse 2, "For there is nothing covered that shall not be revealed, neither hid that shall not be known." Jesus said everything will eventually come to light, and two writers confirm this. Great truths are discovered one after one, says Dr. Wiley. They are opinion first, they become the basis of action next. Proofs begin to gather around it. Events fall out which throw light upon it. For the truth, in fighting its way, has left behind it so many monuments of its power. So true. Lucy Maynard Salmon was a very detailed historian, a professor of history at Vassar College, and a member of the executive committee of the American Historical Association. And continuing from Wiley, she said that the most obvious reasons that compel the rewriting of history concern its subject matter. And of all these, the most obvious is the simple fact that new material is being constantly found. Today, material that was previously available only for the few is being made available for all. History again needs to be rewritten in order to prune away the excrescences of tradition. In history, as in nature, tall oaks form, little acorns grow. Thus, history must be rewritten to separate the kernel from the worthless husks. God wants man to come back into a true worship of him as the creator. And the modern scientists, unbeknownst to the people in their fields, are providing truth that will reinforce how authentic and historically accurate Genesis chapter 1 is. As scientists continue to study the layers upon layers on how intricate the human body is designed, and trained scientists via peer-reviewed studies are relaying to the public credible data that will help us to unlearn the foolishness of ethnocentrism. That though man may differ in his genetic features, his hair texture, and his different skin tones, he is still the same species. And when he closely analyzes all the different materials the human body is made from, as shown in many previous studies, Cornell University confirmed in a scientific journal that man was made from the different materials of the earth. Although it may be hard for secular scientists to swallow and stomach, Genesis once again has been proven to be true. And when they have compared a modern skull on the left with an early ancient skull on the right, though the smaller skull has been called a Homo sapien and the larger one a Neanderthal, they are only just words. They are both just human beings. And new evidence on the latter, the larger skull, is shattering contemporary scientific views.
Fossilized remains of a human-like creature were first discovered in the Neander Valley, hence the name Neanderthal.
Imagine bringing to life our closest cousin.
We start by removing the nuclear DNA and then replace it with DNA from the Williams specimen.
Who's gonna carry the embryo?
I will.
Baby boy. Congratulations, Mom and Dad.
This is William, a healthy, week-old Neanderthal baby.
Are you a proud father, Dr. Reed?
Very proud indeed.
The question here is what is best for William?
Caveman, get back here.
You're not a caveman.
I know, I'm a Neanderthal.
And that means that you are very special.
This film, according to the discovery of that large skull, falsely presents early Europeans as having a funny shaped forehead. But when I closely assess these early humans, the evidence available gives a completely different picture to what modern secular science presents to the public. We tend to think of the cooking of food as a kind of recent phenomenon with our modern day gas cookers. But guess what? Studies have been published that not only did these early Europeans use the same cooking techniques as us, but were also able to detoxify essential plants and render them edible. The Smithsonian documents that our early human ancestors in Europe were more advanced than previously believed. And the New York Times is clear that the Neanderthals were people too, though they falsely depict them as trolls. For those of us who live in the built-up modern-day cities, when we are too lazy to cook, we use an app and food is delivered to our front door. But early men had to hunt for their food, and these early Europeans in Germany used to hunt elephants for their diet, which was a proper meal for the whole family. But these huge elephants are now extinct. They no longer grazed the lands of Europe, and they were a lot bigger than the woolly mammoths, and their meat could feed 1 800 people for a whole month. The elephants that once roamed northern Europe were a lot bigger than the ones that remain in both Africa and in India today. And modern Germany is a whole lot different to ancient prehistoric Germany. And the picture we are getting, according to the evidence that is available to us, is that both man and beast in early times were a lot bigger in stature, there was no evolving, than man and beast today. So as Lucy Maynard Salmon said, history has to be constantly rewritten. And the evidence always leans a lot closer to the divine historical account in the book of Genesis. In the pre-flood and post-flood world in Genesis chapters 4 and 10, we are told that early man built cities. And when we look all over the world, though it may have occurred in different episodes in Earth's history, all races from their inception built cities to cater for their vast expanding populations that they ruled and governed. And even though there are absolutely stupid and ridiculous ethnocentric debates and fights in the social media space of who created the first highly sophisticated civilization, it is irrelevant. For what is it going to prove? For as shown in the previous study on AI, Forbes magazine said that why haven't we found civilizations older than 7,000 to 8,000 years old? This means that the Earth is pretty young. But what exactly is civilization? To make men, you need civilization, says the 19th century American academic Alexander Crummell. And what I mean by civilization is the action of exalted forces, both of God and man, producing letters, literature, science, philosophy, poetry, sculpture, architecture, yea, all the arts, giving scientific precision to morals and religion, stimulating enterprise, extending commerce, creating manufactures, expanding mechanism and mechanical inventions, producing revolutions and reforms, humanizing labor, meeting the minutest needs, all the fruits of civilization. First, witness. The most interesting portion of Bible history comes after the flood, says the 19th century American historian George Washington Williams. It is fair to assume that God gave how many? All races of mankind civilization to start with. We infer this from the character of the Creator. God had created all nations of men to dwell on all the face of the earth out of one blood. He called their attention to the fact that God had fenced all nations in by geographical boundaries and had fixed the limits of their habitation. Second, witness. So the missing pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are now beginning to fit together. And don't worry, we haven't forgotten Christopher Columbus. We're getting there. But the museums in the UK is where I learnt the best history lesson. And when I purchased my first DSLR camera, I wanted to prove not only how authentic the Bible was, but that God doesn't view us how we view each other, based on race. In the British Museum, Caesar Augustus, the co-founder of the Roman Empire with his stepfather Julius Caesar, is on display, a European ruler. Tiglath-Pileser of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, who scattered the rebellious kingdom of Israel, is also on display. He is a Western Asian ruler. And a king from Africa who people are probably tired of me mentioning, Taharqa from the Sudan. Now there's a reason I mention him a lot. I'm showing people my history, and I'm telling people clearly that I do not look for others for validation. There is ancient pottery from Egypt in Africa, ancient pottery from the Ukraine in Eastern Europe, and there's also pottery from ancient Assyria in Western Asia. This shows that they all practiced the same craft. From the 14th to the 16th century, Afro-Eurasians all had sophisticated art. Benin art from West Africa was a highly sophisticated style of artwork with natural black African features carved into metal. This portrait of a retired townsman from Japan in East Asia is made from wood lacquer pigment, And this bust of King Charles II in England in Northern Europe is carved from stone. And they all use weaponry to defend themselves. These are the very sharp weapons they once used in West Africa in Nigeria. There are samurai swords from the Shogun culture of Japan. And these are the swords and armor once used in medieval Europe. And in both Japan and also in Nigeria, they both had protected armor to safeguard them in battle. And as I walk through the museums in the UK, I realize if people want to eradicate and reduce ethnic tensions, then they need to re-educate themselves, for all nations are basically or exactly the same. And I'll prove what I am saying. During the Atlantic slave trade in the Americas, that is North America, South America and the Caribbean, in the colonies, and during colonialization in Africa, jewelry was stripped from blacks as it was associated with paganism, which angered many blacks, for depending upon what tribe you are from, jewelry had great cultural value and significance. Now many blacks, both male and female, will wear earrings in their ears with the idea that it is reconnecting them with their long lost African roots and culture. And a group of young men were to successfully promote this idea. Now when I was a teen, I told my parents I was going to a Bible study, but I ended up in the Hippodrome in London's Leicester Square at a secular concert to see a group called Jodeci. I wasn't fully converted yet, amen. But I did enjoy the concert at the time. But these young men popularized men wearing earrings in not one but both ears, and it made me realize how influential musicians are on modern urban culture. But as I did a closer research, I began to see that this wasn't the African culture at all who sported two earrings in their ears. This was in all cultures around the world. And in the British Museum, the Greek men from ancient Crete in southern Europe wore earrings in both ears. In Western Asia, men in the Medo-Persian Empire and the Neo-Assyrian Empire also wore an earring in each ear. And I was beginning to see a global trend from antiquity. And the black Nubians from the Sudan also wore an earring in each ear. And I was beginning to observe that no matter how mankind hates each other, his beliefs and ideas are exactly the same. You see, you can find a swastika in the Indus Valley civilization, as well as in China, Japan, and in Korea. And among the artifacts in the ancient Roman Empire and in the Ashanti gold in Ghana from West Africa. And when you look at all the deities throughout Afro-Eurasia, guess what? They're all exactly the same. But when I went to college and university, I was confronted with an idea from the pagan world that helped me grow closer to the Lord. And I'm very shocked at how many people, both in the church and outside of the church, are embracing this belief.
That invasion is here, Rhodey. And we can't even tell who the invaders are.
Goodbye, my son. Our hopes and dreams travel with you.
He'll be an outcast. I'll kill him.
How? He'll be a god to them.
What's the S stand for?
It's not an S. On my world, it means hope.
Well, here it's an S. How about
Excuse me.
You're the answer, son. You're the answer to are we alone in the universe?
A historic and unprecedented event has occurred. The question of whether or not we are alone in the universe has been answered.
taught that the birthplace of the human race is Earth, but it's not.
Do you know what this will do to people when they find out the truth?
It can be difficult for people from underdeveloped worlds to hear that their planet is not the only inhabited planet.
Half a century, biblical scholar and Near East historian Zecharia Sitchin devoted his life to proving the link between human beings and the Nephilim, giants mentioned in the book of Genesis. Sitchin's research identifies them as ancient aliens known as the Anunnaki, who came to Earth from the planet Nibiru.
The late Zecharia Sitchin was an esoteric writer who cleverly amalgamated Sumerian cosmology, ufology, the Book of Enoch, and the Bible. His ideas of extraterrestrial beings coming down to Earth and dwelling with men has recently been popularized with men who have profited handsomely with this belief system. And it is not just ufologists in esoteric circles that has embraced this belief system. So-called professed Christians also believe that fallen angels, who are spirits, formed relationships with humans and produced children. How do spirits produce children? And the film industry has also capitalized on this idea, where they are spreading it throughout the entire earth. And the most popular films with huge franchise profits are sharing this to the public, and it is penetrating into minds in a way it would never have done before. And I shall repeat again, if I didn't watch all that television when I was younger, then I would not be able to review these films from a biblical perspective now that I'm older. And this replica of an artifact in my hand is what Zecharia Sitchin has built his whole worldview on. This view that there are a number of planetary bodies that are inhabited by beings called the Anunnaki. But it is not a new belief system at all. It goes right back into antiquity. In a book titled The Plenary Inspiration of the Holy Scriptures, the best book I have ever read on the critique of the school of higher criticism, the 19th century writer Louis Cosson said that all nations, non-exempt, have taken a fancy for figuring to themselves invisible beings as the inhabitants of celestial regions, whom they have tricked out with all those marks of superiority that charm the heart of man. How have all those creatures of our fancy been comparatively earthly, passionate, selfish, impure, and often odious? See the gods, the demigods, and the whole Olympus of the ancients. See the fairies, the genii, and the sylphs of the moderns. See how the angels in scripture have been speedily disfigured in the books of man, in the Apocrypha of Enoch, for example, in several of the fathers, in the legends of Rome, and even in the more recent conceptions of several of the French poets. Winged, passioned, devout puerilities, sacrilegious idols, immaterial egotisms, celestial wickedness, deified impurities, or the traits of the different characters in these Hollywood films. While all the mythologies speak to us of the inhabitants of the moon and of the planets, the Bible says not a word of them. It says nothing to us about the second heaven. A man who revived Zecharia Sitchin's ideas is a black American named Dwight York, whose followers I had regular run-ins and heated debates with when I was at both college and at university, and I didn't back down from my position. He is currently incarcerated for sex grooming. How true, I can't say, but there is always a danger when you put an individual on a pedestal where there is no accountability. He started off as a soul singer, as he is in the center of this photo with his group. But overnight, he turned into a self-made messiah, where he sports a Roman Catholic Jesuit collar, a kente cloth over his jacket, an Egyptian ankh around his neck, and a Muslim Shrine of Fet's hat on his head. And he wrote books that they labeled the Sacred Tablets. He built like a Disney World compound in Atlanta, Georgia, that was to be like a replica of ancient Egypt, and he attempted to merge many of the ancient and modern pagan religions into one. But this is where red flags stood out for myself. In one of his tablets, he called himself Malachi Zadok, or Melchizedek, as written in the bottom left, and on the right he also called himself the Lamb. The Lamb. Didn't Jesus warn us not once, not twice, but 4 times in Matthew chapter 24 verses 4, 5, 11 and 24 that one of the signs of deception in the end will be those who will try to impersonate him? It's interesting. Now, when I would have debates with one of his followers, they would say that when Ezekiel saw a wheel within a wheel, he was actually seeing UFOs. Oh Lord. I knew where they got that idea from. It was from the author Eric von Daniken and his book The Chariots of the Gods. So I purchased one of Malachi York's tablets, which is the Nibiru and the Anunnaki, and you can see that it is Zechariah Sitchin hook, line and sinker, which is what the Nubian philosophy was built upon. For all modern day black consciousness is built upon ideas that they just borrowed from white people. No originality at all. And I remember when I used to listen to rap a lot in the 1990s, Nubianism influenced groups like Outkast, a group based in Atlanta, Georgia, whose album Ekwamani was Malachi York Nubian philosophy imprinted on the album cover. And their infamous music video Elevators has all of the Nubian philosophy imprinted on it, where the young men are presenting to the public that they are really, guess what? Aliens. That is nothing more than L. Ron Hubbard's Scientology Thetans philosophy imprinted all over that video. And when I would debate with one of the Nubians, he would tell me that God is an alien and that we are not really black people, but we are actually green. If you ever meet any black person and they tell you that they are not really black but actually green people, this is what you do. But my interaction with the Nubians in my early 20s definitely shaped my character and drew me a lot closer to the Lord. But that was also because some foundations were laid from when I was very young. I regularly thank both of my parents for doing 3 things. We had family worship every morning and every evening when I was a young child. And the seeds made me what I am today, despite my faults and my daily battles. The family also taught the importance of prayer, but I didn't understand it until I was a lot older. In my family library, we had books on everything. Books on Black history, European history, encyclopedias, Britannicas, Reader's Digest, books on nature, children's books, and it is very important that you balance what you give to a child. If you only give them religious books only, they will not be able to function and relate to people outside of their religious environment. And the third thing, in 1983, when Margaret Thatcher won a landslide victory and passed the British Nationality Act that determined my citizenship, my parents made a wise decision and took me to the Caribbean in the British West Indies that reconnected me with my family roots so I wouldn't have any identity crisis. It is like a paradise out there with the smallest bird on the entire planet in Cuba, the bee hummingbird, and it has similar animals to Africa like sharks, dolphins, the manatee, sea turtles, crocodiles and flamingos. The Caribbean is predominantly inhabited by people of African descent, though there are people of European descent and Asian descent from China and India, and people from Syria also, and a few of the indigenous still remain. But those of African descent still retain some of its roots, including some of its phonetic language, as one man from Africa observed.
Yo, I don't want to do that there, no. Yes, I didn't know me poe, Brian, alive, eh? That's street. That's patois. Where you go? Yo, who going?
Caribbean culture, you had to have a very deep respect and reverence for your elders, no back-chatting, that also came from Africa. For in a book titled Osiris, the Egyptian Religion of Resurrection, the late E.A. Wallace Budge said that respect for the aged was a characteristic of the Egyptian, and it is found among a large number of modern African tribes at the present day. Today, the UK government is advising people to grow their own food, so that they can cut food bills by growing their own fruit and veg. Now, my mother told me that when she was growing up as a child, they grow their own food. That was watermelons, oranges, pineapples, grapefruit, peanuts, aloe vera, cherries, plums, limes, lemons, plantain, bananas, breadfruit, sugarcane, cassava, potatoes, onions, pumpkins, carrots, and lettuce. And they also had goats and chickens. And before my mother came to the UK and converted from one faith into another, she used to eat pig, nastiness, and duck. And my late grandmother would distribute food for all the poor children in the neighborhood in St. Philip in Barbados. That is true black consciousness. You're supporting your own community. Everything they ate, except from salt and rice that they bought from the shop, was grown on their own land. That is how God has always intended it to be from the beginning of time. And if you were raised in a Caribbean household in the UK, when you were sick, there was no Western medicine, but your parents would get the natural bush. You drank it, it tastes nasty, but the sickness was gone away instantly. And studies have shown that it was an inherited plant knowledge in the Caribbean that was inherited from Africa. If you ever want to know how Caribbean people in the UK and in North America have survived financially and kept their families through hard times, they didn't use the Western banking system that keeps you in debt. They used a system called a Susu Savings Club that helped them to support their families, which was also inherited from Africa. Another name for it was or is a partner or change of hand that keeps you debt-free. The New York Times in 1987 documents how this system works. Tontins is an informal credit system rooted in African tradition. Tontins built on trust are generally made up for indigenous groups, people from the same ethnic background, the same workplace, or the same neighborhood. Every month, each member would contribute a fixed share in a pot. In a 12-member group, each member would receive the pot once a year. My mother is from the island of Barbados, so named by European colonizers, which was originally called Itiroguname, I know I pronounced it wrong, by the Iraq people. That means red island with white teeth. And where my father is from is called Grenada, also named by European colonizers, which was originally called in the Arawak language Kamajuya, which means thunderbolt. Now, we left Grenada just in time. For a number of weeks after, there was a coup, and the leader, Maurice Bishop, and the whole island was under house arrest just before his death. In his own words in a book that I purchased, he said that the CIA and the Catholic Church had infiltrated the trade unions and were using propaganda with the newspapers. But the Caribbean had great importance for me as a child, and its significance was very relevant. When you come to London's Belgrave Square, the road with the highest number of foreign embassies, there is a statue of a man who put the Caribbean on the world map. A man whose exploration still affects the world to this very day, Christopher Columbus. But I knew that even researching this man was going to come up against some very huge obstacles.
About how British colonialism actually made the world decent, separation of powers, habeas corpus, freedom of speech, individual property rights, the respect and the dignity of the individual. Where did all those come from? The Magna Carta, the great thinkers of Edmund Burke to Shakespeare. Why is it that the world actually became more civil?
Yes, Europe is a garden. We have built a garden. Everything works. It's the best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity, and social cohesion that the humankind has been able to build. There's three things together. And here Bruges is maybe the good representation of beautiful things, intellectual life, well-being. The rest of the world, and you know very well, Federica, is not exactly a garden. The rest of the world, most of the rest of the world is a jungle. and the jungle could invade the garden, and the gardeners should take care of it.
Spanish politician Joseph Borrell is the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. He is also the Vice President of the European Commission. He described Europe as a garden, but the rest of the world as a jungle. It sounds like he's reading from Mein Kampf, and Charlie Kirk just repeating what Tucker Carlson said in the beginning, that Europeans, especially the English, civilized the world that they conquered. These talking points are not random statements, but ideas that exist in both the secular and religious Western mind. There is no real distinction. But where does this mindset come from? In a book titled Folkways, as quoted in a previous study, the Oxford-educated Yale lecturer William Graham Sumner said that ethnocentrism is the technical term for the view of things in which one's own group is the center of everything, and all others are scaled and weighed with reference to it. Each group nourishes its own pride and vanity, boasts itself superior, exalts its own divinities, and looks with contempt on outsiders. Each group thinks its own folkways the only right ones, and if it observes that other groups have other folkways, these excite its scorn. When you read the Bible, God is unequivocally clear in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verses 9 and 10 that there is absolutely no new thing under the sun, and anyone making these claims is foolish. We have seen throughout this study, whether you are of black African or white European descent in the center, or of light or dark brown Asian descent like the Mesopotamian kings of Western Asia, mankind is basically the same, he only differs biologically. And one explorer attempted to shatter a traditional, conventional belief. The late Thor Heyerdahl was a Norwegian explorer, and the evidence he saw around the world in his travels didn't align up to how we are taught about the history of global naval travel. So he went to Africa, made the natives make him a traditional reed boat that they were making for thousands of years, and he successfully sailed across the Atlantic from Africa into the Caribbean. And he proved that it did not start with the West. And in his book titled The Ra Expedition, that chronicled his adventures and discoveries, Thor Heyerdahl said, Columbus did not discover America. He rediscovered America. He was the first to show the rest of the world the way to America, but he only arrived there in the year 1492. When America was discovered, nobody knows. It is easy for us Europeans to believe that everything positive, everything which smacks of culture, is due to ourselves. So the gaps I saw in history as a child were now being filled, but I still knew it was going to be an internal war, for I had to do a lot of unlearning of what I was taught. And the archive that preserved some of the most precious untouched historical truths would hold the key. And even though Lucy Maynard Salmon says that history has to be always rewritten, I was to discover that influential people in different fields were to manipulate the past for their own self-interests. History is continuously rewritten, whether by scholars updating their assumptions, activists reframing the records, or politicians massaging the collective memory of their own ends, says the New York Times. But it is the revisionists who are those relativists who distort or simply fabricate the past to make it fit their biases, says the Los Angeles Times. Historically, governments manipulate what we see by managing our perceptions through imagery, and they do this by shaping our views of the present world by distorting the past. And a peer-reviewed study said that this was started in the universities of ancient Greece and in the Roman Catholic Church, where they use clever imagery as PR to cover up a multitude of sins. And one of the biggest challenges I face is when people of your own race are defending, excusing and justifying the atrocities of the past, where they are brainwashed by a deep psychological condition titled Stockholm Syndrome, which is when a person defends an individual or a system that once held them or their forefathers in hostage or bondage against their will.
If you look at the third world, for example, those parts of the third world where the imperialist powers have come in have typically been the more advanced parts of it. They've been the most prosperous ones. Even if they weren't prosperous before they got there, they became the more prosperous parts. Those parts of the third world that the imperialists have never touched are, almost without exception, the very poorest places on this earth.
But one thing that I want to share with you, according to Deuteronomy chapter 28, is that the reason why the Hebrew went into slavery from the beginning was because they disobeyed the laws of God. And that means that it's not the white man, the Babylonian fault, the Persian fault, or anybody's fault. It's our own fault. Because if we were living by the word of the Lord, there would be no subjugation in our clans. There would be none of that nonsense in our clans. So the real reason why people are subjugated is because they've disobeyed the Lord. You can be free mentally, which translates into physically, if you accept Jesus Christ, Yeshua, in your life. I'm not crazy.
The overall message is that we came to America as slaves in various other lands because we broke God's commandments. When you read Deuteronomy 28:48, I want you to listen very good to this. This is one of the curses that fell on us as a people. Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies, which the Lord shall send against thee, in hunger, meaning your enemies will control the food industry, and in thirst, meaning your enemies will control the water industry, and in nakedness, meaning your enemies will control the clothing industry, and in want of all things. Your enemies will control medicine, science, education, religion, everything. Then it says, and he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee. We're the only race that have yokes of iron on our neck and are mentally destroyed now. Because we're proud to say we don't have yokes of iron no more, but we're mentally destroyed.
Look at our traditional leaders and the slave trade. We blame the whites for the slave trade we went through. We blame the whites that they offended us. They took us as slaves. But let's wait for a minute. Who sold the black man to the whites? Who sold the black man to the whites? Our own traditional leaders. The enemy is not outside. The enemy is within. Okuku seku.
Before we gently unpack what these individuals have said, we have to go to the Holy Scriptures and carefully look at the character of God. For I have seen many non-Christians completely switch off Christianity and hate God when they see people defend the slave trade. So let us start in the beginning. In Exodus chapter 34, verses 5, 6, and 7, when God proclaimed his name or character, he describes himself as merciful and gracious, long-suffering, and abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgressions and sins. Now, if God is merciful, doesn't he expect us to have the same mindset? In Micah chapter 6 and verse 8, it says, "What does the Lord require of thee, but to do what? Justly, and to love what? Mercy, just like God, and to walk humbly with thy God." In Micah chapter 7 and verse 18, he repeats again that he delights in mercy. If only we were like that. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 8, it reads that he that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is what? Love. But how far does his love extend? John chapter 3 and verse 16 says, "For God so loved," who? The entire world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not what? Perish, but have everlasting life. And he repeats in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, that not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. For Romans chapter 3 and verse 23 says, "For all have sinned and have come short of the glory of God. In Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 32, God says he has absolutely no pleasure in the death of him that dieth. So we're getting a clearer picture of God's character. In Luke chapter 9 verses 54, 55 and 56, when the disciples James and John wanted permission from Jesus to totally annihilate people with fire. What matter of spirit you are of, Jesus said, for the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And he instructed the disciples what methods to use in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 14. Jesus said, look, if people do not want to listen to what you have to say to them concerning the gospel, you don't argue with them, but keep it moving. And in Matthew chapter 28 verses 19 and 20, he instructed his disciples, as well as he instructs us, to both teach and to baptize all the nations. I would like to ask a very serious question. Did you see in any of those passages of the Holy Scriptures that God said one race of people should be singled out and brutalized and enslaved for their rebellion against God, when he is very clear that he wants them all to be saved in eternity? What was Africa actually like when Europeans began to explore its coasts? For this history will clear up a lot of the distortions of that vast continent. For all of the images we have ever seen of Africa is usually of starvation and poverty. Is a lot of very clever Western propaganda. The first book that I ever purchased on black history while I was in college was The Destruction of the Black Civilization by the late Chancellor Williams, and it was my first eye-opener. Now, Sebastian Munster was a German cartographer, cosmographer, mathematician and Hebrew scholar, a professor of Hebrew. In 1544 he published a color map, which is the earliest or oldest obtainable map of the whole continent of Africa. And all over Africa you see images of a scepter and a crown, with the Latin word regnum, which means kingdom. So Africa has always been occupied with different kingdoms. This early 17th century painting in Japan is titled Important Cultural Property of Western Kings on Horseback. And on the left is an African king. His name is unknown, but early Europeans were aware of their vast kingdoms. In the British Museum, there is a section known as the Benin Art from West Africa. And I asked the question in a previous study, and I will ask it again. Where do you see any images of blacks either enslaving their own or selling them to white Europeans? You just see sophisticated artwork in metal, and they also included the Portuguese in their artwork, some engraved into metal, others into ivory. And they traded with the Portuguese, where both European and African had a very deep mutual respect for each other. And a Dutch artist, when depicting Benin in the 1600s, shows no imagery at all of blacks enslaving blacks. Now, the Democratic Republic of Congo has the second largest rainforest in the world after the Amazon, with the world's deepest river. In recent times, it had the world's most deadliest war, and that's because the untapped mineral wealth of the Democratic Republic of Congo is estimated at $24 trillion. That is equivalent to the gross domestic product of Europe and the United States combined, making Congo potentially the richest country in the world. When a man attempted to control the mineral wealth of his country so that his people can benefit, Patrice Lumumba, he was overthrown by the Belgian government, the CIA, and the UK's MI6. The first slave uprising in North America, the Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina, was conducted by Congolese slaves. And despite of the destructive effects of colonialism, they are still able to strive and persevere. When the Portuguese arrived in the Congo, they saw a highly sophisticated culture, the city of Luango, with its kings, and it also sent emissaries and ambassadors into both Europe and into Brazil. Chancellor Williams said its skillful administration shocked the Europeans, where Portuguese travellers in the 15th century called the Kingdom of Congo a highly developed state at the centre of an extensive trading network. No records of slavery. Her neighbour Angola has a beautiful waterfall, Calandula Falls, and this nation had a female ruler who would put up a strong resistance against the Portuguese army so that her people were not enslaved by the West, as a video game confirms.
Emengi muhatu wa kijinga, nzinga, ngakudiondo, jikima boso wa mesena, tumikeseni musaladi menu, etu, tuanda swama mumishi, ni tumitakula matadi.
In the 1700s, which was the economic pinnacle of the Atlantic slave trade, how did men from Europe honestly describe black Africans? In a book titled A New and Accurate Description of the Coast of Guinea, written by the Dutch merchant Willem Bosman, he said that Guinea is a large country extended several hundred miles, abounding with innumerable kingdoms and several commonwealths. The Gold Coast being a part of Guinea, the Negro inhabitants are generally very what? Rich, driving a great trade with the Europeans for gold, which they chiefly vend to the English and Zeelander interlopers, who are the Dutch. You see, they traded with Europeans, not enslaved their own. First witness. If there was one man at that time period who I've greatly respected, who spoke out against the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade, it was John Wesley, the co-founder of the Methodists. And in his booklet, Thoughts Upon Slavery, this is how he described the people of Africa. Upon the whole, therefore, the Negroes who inhabit the coast of Africa, the river of Senegal to the southern bounds of Angola, where Queen Nzinga once lived, are so far from being the stupid, senseless, brutish, lazy barbarians, the fierce, cruel, perfidious savages they have been described, that on the contrary. He said that they are fair, just and honest in all their dealings, unless white men taught them to be otherwise, and as far more mild, friendly and kind to the strangers than any of our forefathers were. The inhabitants of Congo and Angola are generally quiet people. The natives of Benin are a reasonable and good-natured people. The inhabitants of the Gold and Slave Coast are the most gentlemanlike of all the Negroes, bound in manners toward each other. This is very different to how these black men describe their own forefathers. Second witness. In a book titled A Voyage to Senegal by the 18th century French botanist Michel Adamson, he was exploring the different species of plants within Africa, and he was shocked at what he saw. The flightless bird, the ostrich that lays the largest eggs, was tamed in the countries he traveled to in Africa, where he showed that they use ostriches for racing, that he made a note of in his book. But how did he describe Africa? In 1749, he said that as the island of Senegal is within the dependence of the Kingdom of Uela, the Negroes who live there, especially those who are free or of that nation, are generally speaking very good-natured, sociable and obliging. Since my coming to Senegal, I had observed great humanity and sociableness, which gave me strong hopes that I should be very safe among them, as I was not a little pleased with first reception at Lord of Sars. It convinced me that, and look at the words highlighted in green, there ought to be considerable abatements made in the account everywhere of the savage character of the Africans, and I was of opinion that this should not extend to the nations of Senegal. Which way soever I turned my eyes on this pleasant spot, I beheld a perfect image of pure nature, an agreeable solitude, bounded on every side by a charming landscape. The real situation of cottages in the midst of the trees, the ease and indolence of the Negroes reclined under the shadow of their spreading foliage, the simplicity of their dress and manners, the whole revived in my mind the idea of our first appearance, and I seemed to contemplate the world in its primeval state. Third, witness. So this 18th century French botanist, in his close, minute, detailed observation of the beauty and the natural landscape and the different peoples of Africa in their humble behavior and in their simplicity of dress, said that Africa reminded him of Adam and Eve and of the Garden of Eden, which Genesis chapter 2 and verse 13 said one of the rivers of that huge botanical garden in Eden, the river Gihon, actually flowed around that vast continent of Africa. His description and the two other men of the 18th century also clashes with the black men who unfairly discredited their own forefathers with no documented evidence to prove their claims. We have definitely been lied to about modern history by the revisionists. And in a book titled Fraudacity, written in the 19th century by a Trinidadian teacher and journalist, he interviewed former slaves from different African tribes, and they all admitted that there was no slavery that existed in their own countries. And the late Walter Rodney's book, History of the Upper Guinea Coast, he also said that there are no documented references at that time period to prove that blacks were enslaving each other when Europeans came in the 16th century. When Jesus died on the cross at Calvary, he introduced the new covenant. And men who keep going back to Deuteronomy chapter 28 that mentions the blessings and curses, they still live under the old covenant. For Jesus cancelled all of that at Calvary. It no longer applies to us today. But these black men's statements, not only does it discredit the everlasting gospel and hinders it from spreading throughout the world, but it also gives modern Western colonial and slavery apologists weapons in their arsenal to justify not only the brutality and horrors of what their forefathers did, sadly, in the name of Jesus.
And that servant that don't obey his Lord shall be beaten with many stripes. That's scripture.
Inside Washington's Museum of the Bible, a single volume that is like no other. The so-called Slave Bible. Remarkable not for what's in it, but for what's not. Missing are chapters and verses that might have encouraged uprisings. Book of Exodus redacted. No story of Moses demanding Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Gone is Galatians, and the verse, "There is neither bond nor free, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus." And no Jeremiah. Woe unto him that useth his neighbor's service without wages.
What they've left in are verses such as Ephesians 6:5, which is the famous verse, "Slaves, be obedient to your master."
But also what their descendants are still doing today.
And now for a brief history of slavery. On social media, I come across extraordinary depictions about how Africans lived like pharaohs before Europeans came and laid waste to their paradise. I wish any of this were true, but it's not. It's a fantasy. The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors. Whites didn't go into the interior and round up the natives. They waited on the coast for their black partners to bring them black bodies. The stark reality is that our lives had very little value to our ancestors.
The slaves who were imported into the United States were sold to slavers at that time.
The Civil War was to try to preserve the Union.
And if you ask them, hey, why don't we start taking down statues of the slavers in Africa? Because remember, white people didn't just go to Africa and then go into the deep interior of Africa grabbing slaves. Black people sold them to white people on the coast. Let's take down all memorials of those people.
But
no, they don't want
as everybody knows, the slave trade only existed because people in Africa were selling their brothers and their neighbors and raiding neighboring towns of people who looked exactly like them and selling them to other black people in Africa, some of whom ended up in the slave trade going across the Atlantic, many more of whom went through the slave trade that went to Arabia.
So from about 1650 till just after 1800, the British, not the government, but the British were involved in the Atlantic slave trade.
A very brutal and frightful slave trade.
Yes, it was.
Made possible, of course, by people selling people of their own race in the first place.
The British traders, slave traders, like the other Europeans, arrived on the coast of West Africa, and they didn't go far inland. The slaves were brought to them by other Africans who had enslaved them and sold them. Let's remember, Africans were involved in the slave trade before they got to the coast.
As the book Jesuit Plots clearly states, never trust any historian that does not quote his references. These men and one woman are modern-day revisionists who cleverly distort history. And to understand true history, we have to go back in time and study the records of the men during the time the Atlantic slave trade began. And this is where my knowledge of the Caribbean and my knowledge of black history, current affairs and prophetic history would harmonize together. The Bible prophesied the last world power, the papacy. And one of its most famous medieval Renaissance popes, Alexander VI, passed a papal bull that divided the entire world for both Spain and Portugal to colonize at their free will. And while this may shock people, the papacy described as the King of the North in Daniel chapter 11 is prophesied as dividing the land, which is the world, for gain. So God foretold what they would do, and in their desire for gold, the Caribbean would be one of their destinations that they would conquer. And this is what the Western world's iconic hero recorded in his very own diary, according to that papal bull. Christopher Columbus said that, "I reached the Indian Sea where I discovered many islands thickly peopled." How could he discover it if it was already inhabited? Who did he discover it for? Or which I took possession, which is colonialism, without resistance in the name of our most illustrious monarch, the King and Queen of Spain, by public proclamation and with unfurled banners. To the first of these islands, which is called by the Indians, a name he falsely called the natives, Guanahame, which is in the Bahamas, I gave the name of the Blessed Saviour, San Salvador, relying upon whose protection I had reached this as well as other islands. To each of these I also gave a name, ordering that one should be called Santa Maria del Concepcion, another Ferdinando after the Spanish monarch, the third Isabella after his wife, the fourth Juana, and so with all the rest respectively. I saw lying eastward another island 54 miles distant from Juana, to which I gave the name Española, which means Little Spain. 4 centuries later, Toussaint Louverture, Henry Christophe, originally from Grenada, but specifically in 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines would rename that island Columbus called Little Spain, Haiti, or Haiti, which in the indigenous Taino language means land of high mountains, in honor of the indigenous people who were decimated and wiped out in a Holocaust by the Spanish, when these black revolutionaries defeated the Spanish, French and English armies, becoming the first official state that abolished slavery. I would also like to note that it was a Haitian-born military general, Thomas Alexandre Dumas, the father of the famous French novelist and playwright Alexandre Dumas, who wrote the Three Musketeers and the Mount of Monte Cristo, who was in Napoleon's army, and unbeknownst to himself, he was to help in the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, and I will explain. In a book titled The Approaching End of the Age by biblical scholar Dr. Henry Grattan Guinness, he detailed the temporal fall of the papacy, and I will warn you, most of this will not be understood and will go over your head unless you are a diligent student of Bible prophecy. The times and a half, the 42 months, and the 1,260 days must be fulfilled in the same scale, that is, on the scale of a day for a year. A measurement is found by dating the period from the Edict of Justinian, which constituted the Bishop of Rome the head of all the churches in AD 533, that became official in 538, when the papacy defeated the Ostrogoths. The date of the terminus a quo gives as a terminus ad quem 1793, the time of the French Revolution, in the course of which the Pope was carried captive from Rome in the year 1798, and the papal power received a tremendous shock from which it never fully rallied. So when Pope Pius VI in the centre was captured by France's Minister of War Louis-Alexandre Berthier on the left, Chief of Staff to the Corsican-born French military leader Napoleon Bonaparte I on the right. Who actually made it possible for these two French military leaders to cut through into the Alps to conquer Italy and fulfill prophecy, as this painting shows Napoleon and his French army going through into the Alps to expand his French empire? London's Financial Times documents and says that the 6-foot-tall officer, known to France's Austrian enemies as the Black Devil, a black general in command of troops in the 18th century, Thomas Alexandre, was a renowned horseman, was noted for his intelligence and strength as a soldier in the Queen's Dragoons. By the age of 31, he had been promoted from soldier to general, his humane treatment of civilians earning him the nickname of Mr. Humanity. As commander of the Army of the Alps, General Dumas captured strategic mountain passes that opened up Italy for conquest. Historians are still baffled how this one man could single-handedly fight armies of soldiers on his own and defeat them. But it was this man who opened the doors for Napoleon to successfully enter into the Alps, and this is why my knowledge of the Caribbean, black history and prophetic history would harmonize together, for they all complemented each other. But let us look at slavery from the records of the Spanish. In a book titled Documents of West Indian History, written by the late Trinidadian historian Dr. Eric Williams, using official state documents, it records how Pope Adrian VI fully welcomed the plans of Bartolomé de las Casas, the Spanish Dominican priest who lived temporarily in the Caribbean, to traffic blacks from Africa to the Caribbean to preserve the decreasing number of the enslaved natives. It documents that the advice that a license should be given to bring Negro slaves to these lands was first given by Las Casas, ignorant of the injustice with which the Portuguese captured and enslaved them, pleased the High Chancellor and Cardinal of Tortosa, Adrian A, who later became Pope, would grant the Indians their freedom. Alonso de Sandoval was a Spanish Jesuit priest, and though the Jesuits themselves profited from the slave trade, his own documented accounts are truly different to those modern-day slavery apologists in the English-speaking world, and this is what he said. 1,000 other acts of what? Treachery are performed by Spaniards who do what? Trick them and carry them off afterwards. This is not blacks selling blacks. They were kidnapped and as newly imported slaves and ignorant persons to our harbors. Bartolomé de Albornoz was a 16th century Spanish humanist lawyer and historian who was an expert in both Latin and Greek, and he saw the slavery of blacks as abhorrent and disgusting that was based upon the teachings of Aristotle and not on the teachings of Jesus Christ. And this was the advice he gave to black people. He said that I would advise any Negro who sought my opinion that he should rather remain king in his country than come among us as a slave. For his welfare does not justify, but rather aggravates the reason for holding him in servitude. These are the Spanish records of that time period, and the credible historical data in that era contradicts the apologists and the revisionist false accounts of slavery today. Why is it important to study the slave trade? Today, many people are observing that there are a number of changes taking place in our world. Some call it the Great Reset, others call it the New World Order, but it is not new. In recent times, many nation states have either attempted to enforce or have actually implemented a sort of tyranny over their civilian populations that is called martial law. And many civilian populations have suffered because of it. During the lockdown, the UK was attempting to usher in martial law on the nation, as well as the United States of America. China actually implemented it on many provinces. But what exactly is martial law? According to the US Department of Justice, martial law invokes the temporary substitution of military authority for civilian rule, and is usually invoked in time of war, rebellion, or natural disasters. As my heritage is in Barbados, as scholars are uncovering the archives during slavery, they have identified that the slave states that were micro-New World Order models were one of the first to implement this. The 1600 slave codes in Barbados that were designed to keep the slaves in line were governed after martial law. These were colonies where blacks were under military control, where every single aspect of their lives were closely surveillanced, controlled, and monitored. And who was in control of these slave states or colonies? The Act or Slave Code must be read and published in all the respective parish churches in this island, which was Barbados, the first Sunday in February and the first Sunday in August in every year. So the Protestant churches were not only profiting from the unpaid forced labor of the blacks, especially the profits they made by the Royal African Company, the corporation controlled by the British Crown, but they ruled them with a rod of iron, where even in the 21st century, people still make mockery for that horrific episode in modern human history, especially in the social media space. Mindsets still have not been changed. And though many people are concerned about the introduction of digital IDs, which like our mobile cell phones will hold all of our personal details, this modern tracking device is only a revival of what took place in Barbados and spread throughout North America by Englishmen who lived in Barbados. This is a copy of a slave pass that blacks in both Barbados and in North America had to use to travel with. It was a form of ID, and if they were ever found without one, they would be severely punished. It was through the permission by slave owners to their slaves for them to walk through different plantations. And the modern digital IDs is nothing more than a reintroduction of what was once used in the plantations. But that wasn't the only thing from the slave plantations. Today, the World Economic Forum has a plan in place that by 2030, the whole world would own nothing and have no privacy. To those who are aware of these things, they are shocked. But this was how the blacks lived under the Bajan slave codes, where it said that it is hereby further enacted that all the slaves within this island shall have clothes once every year, that is to say, drawers and caps for men, and petticoats and caps for women. But this isn't the only law they implemented.
We marched together into the Capitol. To slow our advance, President Snow was building a minefield of traps. The sadistic inventions of game makers meant to make sport of our deaths.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 76th Hunger Games.
Our lives were never ours. They belong to Snow, and our deaths do too.
He turns the best of us against each other. Tonight, turn your weapons to the Capitol.
If you listen to that trailer very carefully, as films always will tell us of things to come in the future, it stated that our lives were never ours but belonged to a man, President Snow, who controlled the state, where they turned civilians against each other. This is the sort of society they want to control, and this is exactly what life was like in those martial law controlled slave plantations. Now some may say that I am being a complete killjoy and that I am looking into things too deeply, and it is only a film. But never forget that Russia's Vladimir Lenin, Italy's Benito Mussolini, and Nazi Germany's Adolf Hitler all used art of film to control their civilian populations. And when I was studying film at college, I came across a man whose Roman Catholic Jesuit education of fear runs throughout the psychology of his entire films, Alfred Hitchcock. And when an English theatre and film social critic, John Russell, was interviewing him in San Francisco for an up-and-coming biography, when reviewing this art, he said that film is a way of what? Controlling people, a weapon in the battle of life. This is what the secular world says. So as social critics closely analyze this dystopian novel turned into a film, many have different views to what it is really truly trying to say. But as shown in a previous study, the London Guardian tells us that it is training the young generation to surrender to the state and not to fight against authority. This is what the oppressive slave plantations were like, where they were denied habeas corpus, free speech and property rights, for they were seen as property and merchandise. But if you were to ever pay a visit to London, England, just off London's Putney Bridge in Fulham there is All Saints Church, and in the ground there is buried an unsung hero who championed the cause of freedom for the black race. His name was Granville Sharp, a British scholar and philanthropist. What the US abolitionist John Brown did at the Harper's Ferry raid just prior to the American Civil War with the gun, Granville Sharp was to use his legal skills in court to champion the black cause during slavery. In Britain in the 1700s, there was a thriving small black community. Some even lived among the nobility, and they were free citizens when they were on British soil, according to habeas corpus and the Magna Carta. And Granville Sharp would study British law, and he would fight in court for men who British plantation owners would want to return back to their plantations for profit. And Granville Sharp made the top judge in the land, Mansfield, granted a writ of habeas corpus. But what were the conditions like in those slave plantations?
The data shows us clearly that if you're a black child, you're 6 times more likely to be strip searched than the rest of the cohort, which I think is worrying in itself. But also, when we gave this evidence on the Met Police to Louise Casey, and she, in her report, talked about the way black children are often seen as older, that could be one explanation. I have to say, when I talk to parents of black children, what they say to me is they're shocked, but they're not surprised.
This recent picture shows black men in London, England being stopped and searched in the digital age in the 21st century. Their grandparents in the 20th century in the late 1950s were also being stopped and searched by the English Metropolitan Police. And this was inherited by the British colonial military, who also regularly stopped and searched blacks in Kenya, in East Africa, starting in the early 1950s. And it has not stopped. Do you want to know why? Because this deeply systemic and structural system's early embryonic beginnings started in the Protestant-run British slave plantations, where any slaves who were even suspected of carrying any weapons or even playing the drums were routinely stopped and searched. For when you thoroughly read the 1600s Barbados slave codes or laws, it says that, and for that, as it is absolutely necessary to the safety of this place, that all due care be taken to restrain the wanderings and meetings of Negroes and other slaves at all times, like the global 2020 lockdown. More especially on Saturday nights, Sundays and other holy days, when the whites were all at church, and the using and carrying of clubs, wooden swords, or other mischievous and dangerous weapons, or using and keeping of drums, or other loud instruments which may call together or give sign or notice to one another of their wicked designs or purposes. That is why it is very important to study the intricate structure of the slave plantation system, because what was instituted as a micro model and experiment, a system that makes it virtually impossible to escape if martial law is in place and imposed on a community. This is what the invisible government is planning to implement worldwide. Many people can see that something isn't right, but they don't know where to look for answers. But if you study Bible prophecy, we see in Daniel chapter 3 verses 10 and 11 and Revelation chapter 13 and verse 15 that history always repeats itself, that whosoever does not worship the image will be killed. What happened in the past will repeat itself in the future, and that is why God instructs us in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 15 to study the past. Why? Because history repeats itself over and over again. As I conclude this testimony, it is now becoming a lot more clearer why as a child I had a big issue with Christopher Columbus. For not only am I a descendant and a product of a system that he set up, but as Thor Heyerdahl said, his system is not new, and I will explain why. As documented in a previous study, the University of Pennsylvania published a study in 2004 titled The Scientific Evidence for Pre-Columbian Transoceanic Voyages under the Sino-Platonic Papers. And there is a recent trend that some have said will reduce cancer. It is called vaping, and it is popular among this young generation. But where did this modern trend of smoking that spread around the world develop? It was from the cultivation of the tobacco plant in the Americas, and whose unpaid labor was used to develop it and create wealth and a lucrative business for the West. Black African slaves were the very insignia for the state of Virginia, were slaves with the tobacco leaves on the bottom left. But there are some things that are puzzling modern scientists. When during autopsies on Egyptian mummies, scientists can't explain what cocaine and tobacco from the Americas is doing in the intestines of the ancient Egyptians, it is clear that it is a result of pre-Columbian travel. The pineapple is indigenous to Brazil in South America, but the 19th century English Assyriologist Sir Austin Henry Layard on the right and Sir Henry Crensick Rawlinson on the left saw pineapples engraved in 7th century BC Neo-Assyrian art. And the 19th century Egyptologist Sir John Gardner Wilkinson also saw pineapples in ancient Egyptian art, which shows again that men have been traveling back and through to the Americas for hundreds and thousands of years. But it is when we go to the book of Genesis, we discover a race or tribe of people who were known as the ancient world's experts in naval travel and trade. The people who the Greeks called the Phoenicians were known in the Bible as the Canaanites. They were Noah's grandchildren, descendants or sons of Ham, who had very big beards and an olive brown skin complexion. They looked biologically different to their distant relatives, the Cushites, also descendants of Ham in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 6. The Cushites differed in their very dark skin tone complexion and in the texture of their hair. But as you can see, they both wore bling in their ears. The Phoenicians or Canaanites were geographically based in the Orient in the east in what is now called today Lebanon. And the medals that have come down to us shows that they were excellent navigators or mariners according to Ezekiel chapter 27. And they created the world's first alphabet that was used in trade, as Herodotus, the 5th century BC Greek historian, records in his works. And the current Lebanon flag also tells us what they were renowned for in the ancient world. Their famous trees, the cedars of Lebanon, that the ancient world once depended upon, that included the ancient Egyptians, who mummified their dead with a resin or sap from that tree. In a book titled The Concise Dictionary of the Bible, when describing their legacy in the ancient world, Sir William Smith said that Phoenicia, the name was not the one by which its native inhabitants called it, but was given to it by the Greeks. The native name of Phoenicia was Kenan or Canaan, who were the great maritime and commercial people of the ancient world. First witness. In a book titled The History of the Scottish Nation, Dr. Wiley, verifying the first witness, said, quote, "Centuries before the great Macedonian had commanded his victorious career, the adventurous navigators of the Phoenician seaboard had explored the darkness of the Hyperborean Ocean. They were the first to steer by the pole star. They boldly adventured where less skillful mariners would have feared to penetrate." Second witness. I used to believe as a child that navigation began with the Europeans. I was very ignorant to the history that God left in the Bible of early civilizations. Though he was preceded by the Portuguese, Christopher Columbus is the modern naval master of the oceans. What started with an Italian Catholic was to continue with Sir John Hawkins, the English navigator and explorer of the English Protestant world, where both Catholic and Protestant nations would continue the slave trade. They may have clashed theologically, but when it came to slavery and later racism, they were of one mind. But the Canaanites preceded the modern naval Europeans by thousands of years, and their naval legacy is left on their coins with their ships engraved on metal. But though they were technologically sophisticated, it seemed like the curse of Noah still stuck, and God had a big issue with their behavior as a people. That was to continue with the descendants of Japheth in Europe, where Paper Rome, as is coined from the EU of Europe, highlights is a woman sitting upon a beast as a religio-political power, as she is described in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3. And God identified her role on the international stage, which was a revival of the Canaanite people in the system of Tyre. Just before the second coming of Jesus Christ, we are given a detailed account of this last power and her dealings in both the political and financial world. We think of global trade in commodities like spices as a recent phenomenon. And when we think of trade that keeps all nations financially stable, we think that it is something that miraculously sprung up in the modern age. But when God is describing both Tyre and Papal Babylon in Ezekiel chapter 27 and verse 32 and Revelation chapter 18 and verse 19, the world will be wailing over them because of their spiritual decline. In Ezekiel chapter 26 and verse 13 and Revelation chapter 18 and verse 22, both of these systems will come to an end, where what they will do will be heard no more. In Ezekiel chapter 28 and verse 2 and Revelation chapter 13 and verse 6, these two systems both think that they are higher than the authority of God. Foolishness. In Ezekiel chapter 27 and verse 13 and Revelation chapter 18 and verse 3, they are both deeply immersed with the political powers, the kings of the earth. But in Ezekiel chapter 27 and verse 34 and Revelation chapter 18 and verse 23, they are heavily involved and doing business with the merchants of the earth, which is how they both earn their money and how they acquired great wealth. In Ezekiel chapter 27, it lists all the different products Tyrus trades in: ivory, fine linen, purple, the persons of men, that is slavery, brass, horses, wheat, oil, wine, chariots, lambs, rams, goats, silver, iron, and precious stones and gold, just to name a few. In Revelation chapter 18, Papal Babylon trades with the exact same products. And as you can see at the bottom, slavery is listed as one of her vast economic assets. And anyone defending that system, well, you're going to have to give an account to God. So they both traded in wine, horses, gold, precious stones, oil, lambs, sheep, wool, brass, purple, and fine linen. We may think that wheat is a new product of trade, but in both ancient Egypt and in ancient Mesopotamia, men have always been growing, cultivating, and selling wheat. The stone marble has always been used in art in both the ancient world and in modern architecture. And in the British Museum, the Phoenicians or Canaanites sarcophagus is made from, guess what? Marble. And I will say it again, there is no new thing done under the sun. Throughout modern history, Africa has produced most of the world's ivory from its vast elephants, and the Phoenician Canaanite culture was renowned for its ivory in its detailed art. And if you ever go into the British Museum in London, England, you will see her very detailed art from ivory still preserved so that the world can see. And in a credible peer-reviewed study by PLOS ONE on elephant ivory from Africa, it says that Eastern and Southeastern Africa are known to have been major sources of elephant ivory supplying the Mediterranean world, Western Europe, the Persian Gulf, India and China for at least the past 2,000 years. So the African elephant's ivory has been used in art and is used to make buttons, cutlery, snooker and pool balls and piano keys. And this journey of mine all started because I had an issue with Christopher Columbus. And I repeat, if you ever want to at least help to heal racial tensions in this world, show man what the Bible says, that there is no new thing under the sun. This is why from Eden to this very day, God's name is under attack. And the modern generation is sadly being trained in social or neo-Darwinism and being taught that they are nothing more than animals, not only in entertainment, but in the most credible scientific journals. But the most encouraging thing for myself is when parents tell me that little children watch these videos all on their own and they don't complain that it is too long. So as I close this chapter, my testimony is this: if you really want to seek God, all the answers to the mysteries of life are waiting for you to embrace them in the Bible. So I hope this testimony was an encouragement to yourself. And as you can see, I've had to unlearn loads of things throughout my life, especially these last 10 years doing Even at the Doors as a result of studying Christopher Columbus. Due to the financial climate, the next video will be one of the last videos of Even at the Doors for a while. But as I encourage at all times, please research everything you see in this study and all the studies of Even at the Doors.